Hello guys, my name is Vasyl Pekhno, I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and right now I propose to all of you to watch this video update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of July the 30th. So please join, watch this video, like it, subscribe to this YouTube channel, leave your comments just below the video. I will start today's review with some bad news which are connected to Russian deep strikes with ballistic missiles on our territories. Especially let's watch on the map. Let's start with that. Yesterday evening, it became known that Russian ballistic missiles. If you remember, there was a ballistic alert, a ballistic threat yesterday around 7 or 8 in the evening. So the ballistic missiles struck the border area of Chernihiv. We're talking about Chernihiv, where our training ground is located. It's one of the training grounds, a training center for the land forces of the armed forces of Ukraine. By the evening, the land forces had already acknowledged the strike. As of 21:30, unfortunately, we have 3 dead and 18 wounded service. It was a missile strike on the territory of one of the training units. Unfortunately, this is the situation that has, regrettably, it can be said that the situation is repeating itself. We have training grounds near the front line, reconnaissance drones are circling over them, and then in coordination with these reconnaissance drones, ballistic strikes are carried out. Everything seems to be as described, but for example, here is a comment from an extremely competent person who certainly can't be suspected of indulging the general Syrskyi Flash. Here's what Flash writes. The missile strike on the Chernihiv training ground. Mostly only those who neglected safety measures were affected. Everyone knew that the UAV spotter was hovering over the site. There are no hundreds or dozens of casualties there. So he is debunking Kremlin propaganda about hundreds and dozens of deaths. At the moment, the number being discussed is 3, but 3 is still a lot. This shouldn't happen. But as Flash writes, you see, he points out that it's a matter of safety measures. Of course, there are logically two sides to this coin, so to speak, when it comes to such a tragic event. If safety measures are neglected, whether by the servicemen themselves or by their commanders, then one must be aware and prepared for the possibility of such a tragic situation occurring. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the flip side of the coin is that the question still remains relevant. Is it possible to ensure that enemy reconnaissance drones do not hover over our training grounds, training centers, and other facilities where large numbers of personnel are gathered? What needs to be done? What kind of wall of anti-drone systems or anti-aircraft missile complexes needs to be put in place? And this question will probably remain relevant as long as the war continues. Obviously, unfortunately, we are not seeing any complete solution to this issue at the moment. But, well, this tragic event has happened. And on the other hand, it is being acknowledged. At least, as they say, you have to acknowledge the problem, you have to respond quickly to the problem and speak up. And now the ground forces are acknowledging such problem. As of yesterday, at 21:30, we have 3 dead. And on the other hand, I would like to draw attention to the deep strikes. Our deep strikes are delivering on the territory of the Russian Federation. However, unfortunately, not ballistic missiles so far. We haven't heard much about the active use of ballistic missiles, even though they do exist. There have been rumors from everywhere that they exist. The only question is the scale, the quantity of those ballistic missiles. Yesterday, there was, well, actually, not just yesterday, but the night before last into yesterday, there was an interesting strike. It hit the settlement of Syrskyi. You can see what kind of fire was raging there in Syrskyi, which is a railway hub in the Rostov region. This strike that hit there caused a massive fire, a large intense blaze, and thick black smoke, which, according to preliminary data, resulted from a hit on a fuel oil facility used by the Russians. Obviously, such fires disrupt logistics and interrupt railway traffic throughout the area. In addition, by the way, it is claimed that at the moment our drones arrived there, there was also Russian equipment present at the site. And in one of the photographs, this can be indirectly confirmed. Here is a photo where you can see that some kind of truck was being transported. So it is quite likely that military equipment was also being moved. What is interesting about this strike? Let's first look at the deep state map to see where the settlement of Syrskyi is located. This is the Rostov region. So here it is Syrskyi. This is the intersection of 3 transport routes at once, coming from the south and the center of Russia and further on to Rostov-on-Don. So Syrskyi is undoubtedly an important logistical hub, And even if it is put out of operation for just a few days, it already creates problems for Russian logistics. But the most interesting thing, and why am I drawing attention to this? The most interesting thing is that this general disruption of logistics, especially rail logistics, in the territory of Rostov Oblast, has already become the norm for our long-range operators over the past 10 days. 7 incidents, friends. 7. There have been 7 cases of railway strikes in the Rostov region and Krasnodar Krai recently. For example, an international community like Intelligence Insight, for instance, is publishing a photo like this. Let's take a look at it. What is this? Strikes like these are deliberate disruption of logistics between Rostov and Volgograd. They provide statistics for the past 3 days when strikes occurred on other targets in this, let's say, in this sector. For example, a traction station was destroyed in the settlement of Zhutove on the 27th. In addition, the Voynaya on the 29th, that is yesterday, was also hit, as well as the station. And Salsk was struck too, which I just showed. Besides this, it is also worth considering other railway facilities that are being targeted in the territory of Rostov region as extremely important. Let me mark everything where these sites are located. In fact, Novocherkassk is actually one of the areas that was hit. There were also strikes on the settlement of Timashevsk. Timashevsk is actually a huge railway hub. And right here, approximately at the junction of Krasnodar Krai and Rostov Oblast, there is also another location, Pishano-Kopska, where drones also struck. This is also a railway station. In short, blocking this area, disabling the railway even for a few days. Obviously, it's impossible to destroy the railway even if you hit the train stations or, let's say, cut off its power supply. It gets restored. It gets restored fairly quickly in 2 or 3 days. In the same way, the Russians tried to do something similar to us, shutting down our traction substations, but overall it didn't have any effect because our logistics are probably not so focused on the railway. For the Russians, on the contrary, the railway is their backbone, their main story. And even if they repair those targets hit by our drones in just a few days or even hours, let's say 10 or 20 hours, it still causes inconvenience. It slows down logistics. It creates problems. This creates both military and economic problems. And so, in particular, when we talk about military targets, I want to highlight once again these 2 military districts, Novocherkassk and Salsk. In my opinion, they are primarily about militarily slowing down enemy logistics, particularly in the Donbass, where clearly the second wave of the Russian offensive is currently taking place. And this change in frequency or change in the intensity and pace of supplying what's needed, it affects the overall pace of the Russian offensive in the Donbass. And Rostov is directly connected to the Donbass. Let's recall how our forces carried out similar strikes on logistics in the Zaporizhzhia region in its temporarily occupied part when train convoys were destroyed. In the Tokmak area, which is ultimately the main occupied railway hub, and our drones, special operations units of the main Intelligence Directorate, the Security Service of Ukraine, mechanized units, and long-range drone operators, all of them struck convoys carrying equipment, struck convoys carrying fuel. All these did not completely destroy Russia's ability to advance, for example, in the Zaporizhzhia region, but it definitely changed their plans because every military operation is planned out almost down to the hour and sometimes even to the minute, yes. Accordingly, all these disruptions in supplies lead to problems. Problems arise, for example, when the frontline units have equipment, but no fuel. And this concentration of equipment can, for instance, be targeted by missiles or aviation, or vice versa. There is no equipment, only infantry equipment is needed, aviation is needed, air defense systems are needed. All of this opens up certain windows of opportunity. And it was precisely these windows of opportunity that our soldiers, our defense forces in general, took advantage of in the south, in the Zaporizhzhia region. And basically what we see now is that the maximum the Russians can do in the Zaporizhzhia region is make tactical moves. As for Donbass, a very similar scenario is currently unfolding. That is, if we're talking about the areas of Novocherkassk and Salsk. But when we talk about other areas like Timashevsk and the other settlement I mentioned, Pishano, Kopsky area, it's likely not just about supplying the front, but also about shipping hydrocarbons that go through the Black Sea ports. Here we have Primorsk, Akhtarsk, Yeysk from, where, by the way, drone launches are carried out, and many others along the eastern coast of the Black Sea, through which the Russians eagerly trade their oil product. And so disrupting the transshipment process undoubtedly affects the Russian economy, which very soon, as Trump mentioned yesterday, within 10 days, that is, by the 8th of August, they are expecting some steps from the Russian Federation, otherwise serious economic tariffs or other sanctions, or perhaps some other measures will be imposed on them. In other words, Russia is facing generally tough economic times, and our drones are only adding fuel to the fire. For example, cyber specialists are also adding to the situation in the same way. The recent hacker attacks on Aeroflot have essentially brought Aeroflot's entire system to a standstill for a significant period of time. And all of this is also about the economy.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
So I've given quite a lengthy introduction to the map, but it's important because it reflects the overall logic behind the slowdown of the Russian advance, particularly in the Pokrovsk direction, where unfortunately we are facing a critical situation. The situation is truly critical. I do not share the opinion, the statement made yesterday by MP Mariana Bezula, who wrote that the Russians are already in Pokrovsk. Well, after all, you can't really call the sabotage groups that are objectively present in Pokrovsk the Russians, as if the Russians are in Pokrovsk. These are sabotage groups in Pokrovsk. They are constantly being eliminated here. They keep coming from the south and they keep getting eliminated. That's the process that's ongoing. For now, we still can't say that Pokrovsk has been completely cleared of enemy sabotage. By the way, it's also worth putting a certain logistical emphasis here, because as a result of the recent strikes carried out by our missile forces, there are power outages in Donetsk and Makivka. Some areas of these occupied cities have been left without electricity. This also includes targeted operations specifically against facilities seized by the Russian Federation, so that they cannot carry out their offensive calmly and effectively in Donetsk region, in the Pokrovsk operational zone. These strikes are on our temporarily occupied territory. But let's return to Pokrovsk and the critical situation here. The first thing to understand is that this wedge the Russians have created along the Pokrovsk-Volnovakha-Konstantinivka highway is unfortunately expanding very rapidly. Unfortunately, it is advancing. We can see how large it has already become. And this wedge is creating a huge, significant problem. It is, in fact, I am not afraid to use this word, creating a threat of encirclement for our troops in the Pokrovsk-Volnovakha agglomeration. This is a very dangerous scenario. It needs to be, what should be done about it? I have already mentioned that our command has sent certain additional forces here. Of course, I can't and won't say publicly what those forces are, but they will obviously be working now, and I don't know, maybe on countering this breakthrough or perhaps on some other symmetrical moves. But what is happening here, and this is something that needs to be highlighted and brought to the attention of our military command, because for some reason I haven't heard a single statement from the president about the fact that we have a critical situation near Pokrovsk and that it is under the control of our top command. Unfortunately, I haven't heard that. And this needs to be paid attention to, because in fact, Rodinsky and the Rodinsky mine have already become a battlefield. Here is the Rodinsky mine, and the occupiers are actively fighting for it. I already reported this yesterday. And besides that, an enemy group got trapped between the lakes. How could this even happen between the lakes? It's basically a bottleneck that just needs to be destroyed by effective mining. It's hard to understand, but they ended up in Rodinsky, just like they're fighting in the eastern part of eastern Krasny Lyman. Enemy groups are making their way here, attacking another mine between Novokonomichne and Mirnorad, which is an extremely important defensive position. So there are two mines, Mirnoradska and Krasnolymansk. If the enemy captures FIMAS, I already mentioned yesterday, and frankly, we probably shouldn't expect a good scenario for Pokrovsk. In fact, there aren't that many scenarios overall, if we're being honest about the future, but the threat of encirclement is real. It is becoming increasingly clear and obvious. And here, the picture, the scenario of what the Russians are pushing for becomes clear. They want to cut off one of the main supply routes to Mirnorad right now. This route goes through Rodinske, Bilitske, and Dobropilia. This is the road that leads to Dobropilia. Dobropilia is an important hub for our communications in this direction. It's a hub that the enemy is also attacking. As you can see, they are already reaching the gray zones near Novi Shakovi. And from Novi Shakovy, there is practically nothing left to Dobropiria, just 10 kilometers, so to speak. So this is really a critical scenario of what we are hoping for, what we are observing here. A very dangerous situation is now unfolding for us in the Pokrovsk and Milorad area. Further south, in the Novopavlivka direction, the Russians are also expanding their offensive toward the borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region. In fact, in most areas, they have already advanced there, except perhaps for the settlements of Iska, Oleksandrorad, and Komishuva. Even near Oleksandrorad, there is Voskresenka, a settlement, and here the Russians are claiming a major victory. In fact, recently there have indeed been their advances here, expanding what you might call a gray zone. The Russians are claiming that they have already captured the first settlement in the Dnipropetrovsk region, Malivka. But the soldiers of the 31st Mechanized Brigade, who are defending here, refute this disinformation from the enemy, who claim that their 336 separate Marine Brigade, which unfurled a flag in Malivka, so-called flag stick, as they often call it, the soldiers of the 31st Brigade have shown that this does not correspond to reality by destroying both the enemy assault group that broke through, and objectively, they do break through there. But at the same time, by destroying them and not allowing the propaganda to continue, our soldiers from this 31st Mechanized Brigade, on the contrary, after eliminating the enemy, re-entered the settlement of Malivka in the Dnipropetrovsk region and unfurled their own flag, their own banner, showing that, well, even if it is not physically controlled by our troops, it is definitely controlled by our drones, which we can now, after all, observe in this video. As you can see, the blue and yellow flag with the emblem of the 31st Mechanized Brigade is visible in this video. So for now, this is just propaganda. It does not reflect reality, but it could become reality soon if the Russians reach one of the settlements in Dnipropetrovsk or Zaporizhzhia, already beyond the borders of Donetsk region. This could be true. This could become reality. I think that in the near future, the Russians have the ambition to reach the line along the axis of the river and, in fact, to secure that line. In this way, they would form an axis, a front line. Well, at the very least, this is the kind of ambition they must have or could have in the near future. Meanwhile, on the Zaporizhzhia front, where exactly is not being disclosed, of course, the commander-in-chief Syrskyi visited the positions of our troops. By the way, he highlighted the Zaporizhzhia direction and claims that he is keeping it under special control. It is quite likely that Syrskyi was in areas close to where the latest Russian advances took place, namely Kamyansky and Plavny, because he specifically highlighted this area in his post. Syrskyi noted that there are comparatively fewer combat clashes here than in other sectors, but recently the enemy has been intensifying its offensive actions in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, particularly in the area of the settlement of Kamyansk. It is worth mentioning that our troops have now pushed the Russians out to the northern outskirts of Kamyansk, and in connection with this, Syrskyi has done his work, as he says, in Zaporizhzhia. According to the commander-in-chief, we are aware of the plans of the Russian occupier. Well, we'll see how the situation develops further, because as of this moment, the enemy's active offensive is being disrupted, including by strikes on their logistics, which I mentioned at the beginning, and also the active operations that are worth highlighting, which took place simultaneously yesterday on both the Kinburn and Tendriv spits. The Kinburn and Tendriv spits, along with their base, were the locations where units of the Defense Intelligence and the Security Service of Ukraine operated. In particular, here on the Kinburn Spit, units of the Crimean Security Service entered with their drones and, together with the defense forces of Chernihiv, destroyed enemy positions. In fact, they may not have physically entered, but rather reached the area with drones. They found ways to use drones to get to the occupiers' positions and destroyed enemy positions with those drones. By the way, these are Shrikes, I believe good, friendly, and well disposed towards me. The FPV Shrike is actually made by the same manufacturer, by the way, who produces the Vampire drones. These drones are of very high quality. And in some ways, well, if not game changers in the war, then certainly very important components of it. So drones are striking the occupiers' positions on the Kinburn Spit. And as for the occupiers' positions on the Tendrivska Spit, which is also territory occupied by the enemy in the area near the mouth of the Dnipro and even further south, where the Dnipro already, where it's basically the Black Sea in this zone, this is about the Tendrivska Spit, where GUR fighters have entered They show the video like this, where they approach the positions in boats, destroy targets there, and carry out combat operations in the northern part of the Black Sea. This happened on the 28th of August, that is the night before last. On the night of the 28th of August, the scouts landed. They landed on the Tendrivska Spit and eliminated the positions of the occupying forces. It is claimed that this was the elimination of the occupying forces, along with their personnel, the electronic warfare complex Zond, and the radar station Rose. And of course, well, these are undoubtedly very brave actions. And here, well, to say anything more, I can't even imagine what it's like to go behind enemy lines like that under the cover of night, to move, to travel by water. This is an exceptionally outstanding operation. The only thing is, I've sometimes heard some skepticism from certain intelligence officers saying, what's the point of these operations if by doing them we reveal some weak spots in Crimea to the enemy, for example, and then when we actually need to enter Crimea, the enemy will have reinforced those weak points. Honestly, I don't understand any of this at all. I'm just stating the fact. The defense intelligence of Ukraine reaches the Tendrivska Spit, and the security service of Ukraine flies to the Kinburn Spit. This is encouraging because Crimea continues to remain in the focus of our intelligence officers. But purely from a professional standpoint, I am not competent to analyze or comment on this in any other way. I'll leave this niche to those who truly know and understand. I'm simply stating the facts in the format of a battlefield map review, which I hope you like by the end of this overview. And also subscribe to the YouTube channel. And well, that you'll approach any information whether it appears in our information space, the enemies, or a neutral one with a cool head. Well, friends, thank you for your attention. Take care of yourselves. All the best, and see you next time.